for joining us. I'm Karen Storwick. I'm the Director of Communications for the Royal Alberta United Services Institute, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the fifth in our series of presentations. With a push of a button, can cyber threats cause armed conflict or nuclear wars? For those of you who are new to us, who aren't familiar with RAUSI, the Royal Alberta United Services Institute was founded in 1920 as a think tank at the end of the First World War. And over the decades, it evolved into a veteran service organization. We're now returning to our roots and evolving back into a think tank. And tonight we're honored to have Dr. Joe Howard present his research on cyber warfare. He did his doctoral thesis on the international law of cyber warfare. And Dr. Howard trained at the NATO Cyber Warfare School and has 29 years of service in the Canadian Forces. Joe will present for 20 minutes before we open the floor to questions. And just a few housekeeping items tonight. We will ask you to keep your mic muted through the presentation, please, and through the question period. When it does come time for questions, there are two ways that you can ask questions. You can either raise your hand in the icon in the toolbar at the bottom of your chat box, or you can simply state in the chat window on the side that you would like to ask a question. We're going to try to encourage everybody to ask their questions in person as opposed to in written form, just to generate a bit more discussion from the audience. Viewing options, I think we're all very familiar with Zoom by now, but at the top of your screen, you have viewing options with the side-by-side gallery or the speaker view. And I will now turn it over to Joe for his presentation. Thank you, Joe.
Karen, thank you very much for those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As Karen said, it's the fifth of we hope a larger number, and it's been scheduled in between hockey games. And I hope that you'll get something out of this. Cyber warfare is quite a popular topic, but it's also hugely complex. And I hope that in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be able to make it less complex and more appealing. So to give you the executive summary in terms of what cyber hostilities are, and I think we should perhaps change the term from cyber warfare to cyber hostilities. Warfare is an old term, and it is more at one end of the spectrum of armed conflict. But as you're going to see tonight, cyber hostilities encompasses a much broader spectrum of hostile and less hostile activity between states and non-state actors. So if you're going to leave in the next 5 minutes, here are the three takeaways you should put your mind to, so at least you can digest them and see what you think. And the first is that hostile cyber operations, they bridge the entire spectrum of security and defense. For those who were at the very first presentation, security is that collective structure of social elements that comprise civil society, and cyber operations permeates that entire population of political and socioeconomic structures. But as you'll see, it also permeates the defense of those structures, the national defense postures. So that tonight's debate has to be holistic if we're going to inform the debate responsibly. The second takeaway is that cyber technology is far and away outpacing developments in international law. And I admit I'm coming to this debate this evening with a bias because that's where my strength is, but that's not to say we can't talk about it in other terms. But as you're going to see, accountability for wrongful action by states is going to be very difficult to implement. Just so you know, as the old saying, when the drums of war begin to beat, the laws of war remains silent. And that will be evident tonight. The third takeaway is a proposition that I'd leave with you for your contemplation throughout the evening. And that's if cyber warfare or cyber hostilities are more cost efficient and more socially responsible and involve less lethal effect and less material property destruction, is there a way to displace kinetic warfare and replace it to some degree with cyber operations? And if so, how do we do it? And if not, why can't we do it? So I'll leave you with that proposition, and then I hope we can have some discussion at the end. So that said, the aim tonight is to offer a balanced appreciation of cyber operations. If we have a balanced appreciation, we're going to be able to engage a more predictive analysis. And the way we get that balanced appreciation is with diagnostic analysis. As you know, there are 4 different styles of analysis: predictive, descriptive, predictive, and diagnostic. So we're just going to dwell with the diagnostic and the predictive tonight. The agenda, the slides, the numbers down the right-hand slide refer to the last slide. So you can see there are 31 slides or so, but trust me, we will not be taking a very long time to coast through them. But we'll start out with looking at what the cyberspace is like, and have a quick look at what cyber weapons are, the targets of those weapons, the risks that states believe they face in modern day as they impact cyber operations, several applications of hostile operations, and lastly, the legal ramifications of cyber operations, concluding with a discussion. So to christen the ground, cyberspace is a fifth domain, as are sea, land, air, and space. So the diagram sets out cyberspace as being one of 5 dimensions. As you can also see, it is not defined by geography. It's defined by function. And that's important when we come to talking about the next point as to territorial jurisdiction. Just to emphasize that cyberspace is a functional domain, and that function permeates all other domains. So cyber activities will occur in space, in airspace, in land, and on sea domains. But notwithstanding that, there is holistic jurisdiction. And this was one of the takeaways from the NATO cyber warfare school in Estonia back in the early 2000s and concluding in about 2014. The international group of experts, namely practitioners, not scholars, but practitioners, representatives from departments of defense, foreign affairs, and heads of state and heads of government, as well as NATO, convened in Estonia over a number of years, and were able to conclude that international law and national law permeate all of cyberspace. And that's important because what it does is it allows any activity in cyberspace to become subject to some kind of law. And that is an important point to bear in mind when we consider some of the applications down later on in the presentation, and whether those applications, if unlawful, can be held accountable, or whether the perpetrators of those hostilities can be held accountable. So having set out what the ground is, let's look at what the weapon is. And it's a great weapon. Cyber is a terrific weapon. it draws on a commonly held asset called digitalization. It is commonly held across civilian and military communities. It is really cheap to develop, and that should be read deploy, my apologies. It's a lot cheaper than a battalion of tanks to manufacture, to train, and to sustain. So there are very few barriers to acquire that common knowledge, which gives rise to what we'll call cyber mercenaries, and we can identify some of them later, but such groups, such hacker groups, anonymous groups such as those come onto the international stage without facing any barriers. Perhaps the greatest merit as a weapon, however, is its stealthy and secretive nature. You will never know, or excuse me, the target will never know that it is being subject to a cyber attack until it's too late. Lastly, cyber is very discriminative. The author of the cyber weapon can target with great precision in both time and space as to where, when, how, and to what extent the cyber weapon can yield battlefield effect. So if you've ever wondered what it looks like, there is an example. It's not very attractive compared to a T-90 or an M1A1 or an F-35, but there it is. And that's an example of some code that does something to JavaScript. The title of the slide says obfuscated, and that is because most cyber code that is malicious is deliberately camouflaged, or in technical speak, it's obfuscated. And one of the jobs of the target will be to de-obfuscate in order to cure or remedy the situation. The weapon is better analyzed if we put it in the context of ODA loops. And as you'll find out in the next slide what ODA loops stand for, it is just a circular train of thought that explains how a particular weapon is developed, deployed, and what the response is. So in the next few slides, we're going to put up what the friendly force in blue and what the enemy force in red do. But when we're looking at these slides, bear in mind that the time required to develop and deploy is a lot longer than to identify and de-obfuscate. But also notice that there are going to be many loops simultaneously. But the problem, as we said before, one of the merits of cyber was that you don't know that it's there. So with that in mind, let's look at the classical ODA loop. ODA loop stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. As you can see, reading from the left to the right, there is the observation model that draws in outside information, circumstances, guidance, and interaction with the environment. And that then flows to the right into the orientation, or more the, if you will, the analysis. There's analysis, there's synthesis. You draw upon previous experience, you bring in cultural and traditional decision-making and analytical models. From that, you decide how you're going to react to the threat that you observed in the left-hand side, the cyber threat that you observed in the left-hand side. And then you're going to act. And once you act, then there will be unfolding interaction with the environment. But at the same time, don't forget that the enemy is doing the same thing. And then in his or her, its first iteration, it is going through the very same process that you are, but in the opposite direction. And so while those two ODA loops are in place, you're going to have to start responding to enemy one. And as you might expect, the enemy then is going to have to respond to both friendly 1 and friendly 2. And this is just in a bilateral model of 2 parties, enemy 1 and enemy 2. But if you can imagine the current day conflict in Russia and Ukraine, there are, and you'll see this in a schematic below, there are many parties, each of whom is engaging in this ODA loop cycle. So the whole complex, the whole cyber battlefield becomes hugely complex in terms of information flows. Notice that no bullets have been fired. Nobody's been killed, at least not yet. All this is a flow of weapons, of weaponized code, such as the slide we saw before. And so that is the cyber battlefield that we have to contend with. Now that we've got the ground laid out and we've spoken about the weapon, we have to then look at the targets. Greg Mitchell's presentation last April, just last month, was excellent in terms of referring to disinformation and how cyber operations can leverage disinformation. So information is certainly one of the commodities that cyber warfare deals with, but it also deals with something called industrial control systems. And ICS, as you will see in the next few slides, they control hard-standing structures. And I've listed 5 of them: banking and currency exchange systems, traffic control systems, wireless telecommunications, regional water and food, and medical facilities. But as you see, all those touch on both the the security structures that we spoke about at the outset, the structures that compose civil society. But they also touch on military use, because all those 5, to varying degrees, are dual use infrastructure. They touch upon military activity and civilian activity. And that's to be expected in a globally integrated society. And that makes a very difficult decision to be made by military commanders as to what constitutes a lawful military target. There is no right answer, but the Geneva Conventions set out that necessity of the target and distinction as to between civilian and military are essential guidelines for commanders in deploying any kind of force. And if you were to deploy malicious code that would prejudice wireless telecommunications of the enemy, but at the same time take down the communications network of an entire country, as Russia did with Estonia back in 2012, sometime, there is a problem with a breach of international humanitarian law. So with that in mind, let's look at an industrial control system. And there it is. That, and you can read on the slide, those are Russian operators on the left and Iranian operators on the right at the nuclear power plant just south of Tehran. And that picture was published in 2013. And that is probably somewhere close to the infamous Natanz nuclear facility. But that is an industrial control system. And you can imagine the networking that goes behind that panel or those panels and those schematics. There is another industrial control system in action. That is the European natural gas grid. And you can imagine how many nodes of industrial control systems there are throughout that very large network. Another example, This is the Maritime navigation grid. There's a live picture of sometime earlier today, this afternoon, as to where ships are. There are a lot of ships in this world. I didn't know that, but as you can see, there are a lot. And if the traffic control system for shipping is attacked, there will be supply chain issues, there will be accidents, there may be friendly fire on friendly fire if there's misidentification of naval ships. The point being that maritime navigation grid is just one of many dual-use infrastructures. And if an aggressor state is interested in launching a cyber attack, it must be careful as to distinguishing what is a legitimate military target from a non-military target. Lastly, satellite communications, something we might not think about as much, but there is a schematic of the Viasat global band coverage globally, as you can see. But I expect that some of this transmission this evening is being routed, it may or may not be routed, possibly via satellite communications. So having looked at the weapon, the ground, and the targets, we are going to have to consider then what is the risk analysis that targets and those who manage targets, what do they have to consider? We looked at examples of just 3 systems. We identified 5. There's probably 105 systems out there. But recognize that due to global integration, any one system will impact other systems. And so cyber-sourced risks that are organic to just one will, by definition, leverage other cyber risks that are external. And this applies whether or not we're living in a peaceful world, and I'm going to call that a variable sum game, where everyone's a winner and it's cooperation, or whether we're in a zero-sum game of unilateralism and regional convergence, where there are many more regional conflicts. The bottom line is that cyber risks permeate everything, everywhere, and a cyber risk in one locale will, by definition, create cyber-sourced risks elsewhere. So as a risk analyst, you have to ask yourself, well, what is the mitigable risk? Is it the risk of the cyber attack or the risk of my system, my cybersecurity system failing? And as you'll see I believe in the next slide, that second point has a huge manpower impact. The Davos Symposium, which was held last January, identified that the international community is short approximately 3 million people who should have cybersecurity expertise but don't. So that is one of the risks. What do you mitigate? Which risk do you mitigate? One of the other larger risks that were identified is quantum computing. I never thought RAUSI would be talking about quantum computing, but if I can simplify it as best I can, quantum computing will break up whatever encryption keys you think you have and whatever security you think you have. Briefly, quantum computing employs the laws of quantum mechanics that your laptop and my laptop simply can't. And it leverages scale and speed beyond a scale that neither of us can truly understand, by saying that a bit of information can be both a 0 and a 1 at the same time. I understood bits were either 0 or 1. Electrons had either a negative or a positive charge. But in the world of quantum computing, They can have both at the same time, and that is what gives quantum computing the huge battlefield leverage. So going back to something we can probably understand a little bit better, this comes out of that same Davos conference of last January. And I've taken the report and identified a select number of states down the left-hand side, and I've collapsed them by region. So the first region is the Middle East, and we have Iran and Israel as my two candidates. They both attended Davos, excuse me, and they ranked what they thought were the greatest risks facing the international community in the next year. And I've gone through and highlighted in yellow those risks which have some vulnerability to hostile cyber operations. So interestingly, Iran did not see any risks that pertain to hostile cyber operations. But just down the road, Israel identified 4 out of 5 of its risks that do pertain to hostile cyber operations: terrorism, interstate conflict, failure of cybersecurity systems, which we mentioned in the earlier slide, and weapons of mass destruction. So why is it that Iran has no such vulnerability, but Israel has 4? I point out that the weapons of mass destruction risk in Israel, I've tentatively linked it to the risk of no economic growth in Iran. Let's move down to the South Pacific region. And I've identified 4 states: China, North Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Interestingly, just like Iran, who is traditionally seen as the aggressor state, as an aggressor state in the Middle East, China and North Korea are also usually identified, at least by Westerners, as being aggressor states. But look across the list. Neither China nor DPRK have got a yellow box. Neither of them believe that they face any risk which has got an impact with hostile cyber operations. On the other hand, Taiwan identifies 1 such risk, and Japan identifies 2. But let's look just beyond that for a sec and look back at China and Taiwan. Both of them list geopoliticalization of strategic resources as a risk. And one wonders if that isn't centered on semiconductor chips or the shortage of semiconductor chips. Let's move to the third region at the bottom of the slide. Shall we call it Northern Europe, where Russia, I identify as the aggressor state, and Georgia and Moldova as target states. You'll see Russia, quite rightly, identifies interstate conflict as its first risk, whereas Georgia, who was soundly trounced in 2008 when it was invaded by Georgia, identifies digital inequality as its second largest risk. Moldova probably is mindful of what happened to the Polish-Russian border, or was it Belarus? Someone might correct me. Last December, was it? When Poland was faced with involuntary migration coming from the north onto its border, and it was only after diplomatic action that the involuntary migrants voluntarily moved on. But the point is that Moldova has 3 risks that I suggest are impacted by hostile cyber operations, including illegal economic activity, which I assume to mean human smuggling and currency exchange. So I don't know if you can see this. If you can't, I'll run over it very briefly. This was a similar graph of the survey taken in 2020 at Davos. And in the top left-hand corner is weapons of mass destruction. And you'll see that the impact, which is the left-hand scale, if there is an incident involving weapons of mass destruction, the impact is very, very high, yet the bottom scale, which is likelihood, records it as being a very low likelihood. Moving to the right and more in the middle, you will read financial failure, which is really on the medium at 3.47 in terms of impact, and it has a slightly larger likelihood of occurrence. Information infrastructure breakdown, followed by interstate conflict, and then in the very top, in the top right-hand circle is cyber attacks, where everybody recorded cyber attacks as having a fairly high impact and a high likelihood. So there you have it, 2022 and 2020. The assessment of risks as determined by the states who decided to attend Davos, and that included a lot, but obviously it didn't include North Korea. And there does not appear to have been that great a change, particularly concerning cyber attacks and interstate conflict. So if we move from the conceptual to the practice, we can look at a few applications. And this is a piece taken out of an Indian newspaper for some reason, but they had this very interesting graph, very interesting graph that sets out who the cyber players are in the Russia-Ukraine dispute. And just for clarification, in the bottom scale, MBR wiper is master boot record wiper. And if your master boot record is wiped, then you are out of business. But those are the different kinds of threats: malware, MBR wiper, ransomware, APT. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but an advanced persistent threat is a cyber attack. So it's malicious software, which is installed, excuse me, on the target, but it remains latent. It is advanced and it is persistent, but it is a non-executable threat until some very late stage in the game. Down the left and right-hand side of the schematic are the identities of the non-state actors. On the right-hand side, the anti-Russians are anonymous, Against the West, DDO Secrets, and Kelvin Security. On the left-hand side, Conti, Free Civilian, Stormers Ransomware, and Coming Project. You may recall at the very outset, we identified that it's really easy to get into the cyber warfare game. The ease of entry is very high. There are very few barriers. All you need is knowledge of how digitalization works. And as you can see, these individual parties to the dispute are there. And we'll identify later. In fact, we can probably identify now agencies in Russia include the FSB, the FSO, and the GRU. I can cite, if anybody wants, I can tell you what they stand for in Russian, but trust me, they are the cyber intelligence agencies who will be involved in this schematic, as will the Ukrainian counterparts. Bottom line is that the cyber battlefield is populated not just with state actors, but with many, many proxies, including other state proxies. So we do not know in this graph, in this schematic that we have before us, where the NSA or the United Kingdom's GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, or Canadian Communications Security Establishment, whether they are participating in this cyber dialogue to any degree or not. We won't know, and we shouldn't know, because if we did know, then the secretive advantage that cyber warfare offers to the participants would be lost. We'll never know. And that is one of the merits And it's also one of the demerits in the international law of cyber warfare. But let's look at another application. And perhaps the best known is Iran. You have before you a picture of Ahmadinejad in 2008 at the Natanz nuclear facility. And what you see before you are those silver tubes called centrifuges. And this facility was attacked in 2007 and again in 2008 and again in 2020. How it was attacked is open to dispute. But one story goes that Siemens Engineering was contracted to build an element of an industrial control system to control those centrifuges. But in the process of developing that software, a bug was deliberately was injected into that software. And then that software was put onto a USB and brought into the facility by a Siemens engineer who quite naturally plugged his USB or her USB into a laptop or a desktop. And thereafter, the Stuxnet worm found its way into the industrial control system. You will recall that panel with the Russian and the Iranian operators sitting in front of it. And that resulted in a 2007 incident where the centrifuges spun too quickly and therefore spun out of control and damaged the facility. This same kind of incident occurred later on in 2020, as this picture shows. And there is another map-int picture, if you will, of Natanz in 2020 with a circle showing that burnt out building. So I'll just back up one. That burnt out building there is that burnt out building in the circle. So if you're a fast reader, you will be able to digest all that, but we can go back to it later. The point being that within the period April 2020 to October 2021, there was 8 cyber attacks, 5 of which were allegedly conducted by Israel, 3 allegedly conducted by Iran. This graph, which comes out of the Economist Intelligence Unit, they refer to the perpetrator, but again, it has to be alleged perpetrator because we will never know. But as skipping down the impact, water pumps, port operations, stolen data, train service, administrative and medical systems, more transportation, medical records, names, photos, and sexual preferences of users. So that is the kind of applications that cyber warfare are found on. But if we can just shift the debate a little bit more to the conventional battlefield that some of the audience may be more familiar with, where can cyber impact be felt in conventional and I guess in nuclear weapon systems? Well, if you think back to those 5 areas of dual use infrastructure, rear area supply chains. If you don't get ammunition for your howitzers, you're out of business. Fire control systems. If they're wireless and you don't hear the order to pull the lanyard, then your artillery system is not going to work. And similarly with communication systems. And as Greg Mitchell pointed out earlier, the disinformation model that influences morale and policy. So if we're going to locate the cyber warfare debate from dual use to just military, there are a few examples of where cyber warfare, hostile cyber operations can have some effect. Bottom line is cyber is a force multiplier in any combined operations. But if it's a force multiplier, I recall the first question we raised at the outset of tonight is that can interstate dispute be conducted purely in cyber terms? And whether it is or not, I hope we'll discuss later. Let's move on to, we're at 40 minutes, my apologies, but we're on the last leg here. The use of force in self-defense, you're allowed to do it. You are allowed to use force if a state is allowed to use force in self-defense. And this comes from the very famous Caroline incident of 1837. If you need to defend yourself, you can do whatever you need to do right now. And that has evolved into something called anticipatory self-defense. And the anticipatory self-defense means that if you detect that there is a threat forthcoming and that it is imminent, then you are allowed to use force, including cyber force, as distinct from preemptive self-defense. And preemptive self-defense reaches beyond the concept of imminence to, well, maybe there is and maybe there isn't. I'm not really sure, so I'm going to do something about it anyway. And that is what got George Bush and Tony Blair into difficulty, legal difficulty, concerning the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in, when was it, 2000, Paul, 2002, whenever it was. But bottom line is that in cyber, recall those ODA loops, the speed with which decisions are made and the speed with which that ODA loop is conducted is going to force anticipatory self-defense to become preemptive self-defense. Time collapses, imminent becomes instantaneous. And so if that's the case, if somebody conducts preemptive self-defense, what is their defense when they're brought up before the International Court of Justice? They can't cite self-defense because there was never a threat that was imminent. It becomes a preemptive self-defense, and the only plea is the plea of necessity, which in 3 words or less means I am allowed to do anything that is necessary to ensure the continued existence of a sovereign state, which is different than self-defense, because self-defense is against an identified threat. Lastly, I've been complaining all along that there is an awful lot of secrecy in this game, and there is. And if there's secrecy, you cannot attribute a cyber attack to a party because you don't know who it is. And then one of the reasons you don't know who it is, there's no evidence, or there's no compelling evidence. So there's been talk around about the burden of proof usually remains on the accuser. So if Iran is going to accuse Israel of the Stuxnet attacks, then the burden of proof is on Iran. Somebody said, look, maybe we should put the burden of proof on the respondent. Israel, you proved that you did not launch that Stuxnet attack. And that argument was put forth and quickly shot down. The other alternative was to reverse the standard of proof. Rather than having a very high standard of proof, scholars and some practitioners said, let's lower the standard of proof. And if it's circumstantial, it's good enough. So we don't know who launched the Stuxnet attack. It couldn't have been Malta. It sure wasn't Canada. But you know who could do it? NSA and the Mossad. They're probably the bad guys in this. So that argument also lost favor very quickly. So there are the 2 big issues in international law that we have to deal with. And on that very happy note, I will say thank you for your attention, undivided, for 45 minutes. I apologize, but let's hope that we can have some robust back and forth and fire away.
Fascinating discussion. And just to remind everybody, that there are two ways to ask questions. If you would please either raise your icon hand, which you find in the bottom of your chat box, or indicate that you would like to ask a question in the chat bar. And in fact, I would like to open the floor with a question. Prior to February 24th, I was under the impression that Russia and China dominated cyberspace with hostile intent. So I'm wondering, and as I'm understanding from your talk, was that actually true? And if so, is that still the case? Has the war in Ukraine changed the balance of power in cyberspace?
I don't believe so. It would be too early to materially change it. But China has got a very robust structure of cyber operations. And I just happen to have a couple of notes in front of me. So if you'll pardon me for reading, and I'll refer you to in the People's Liberation Army, they have Unit 61398. Which is this cover element for the 2nd Bureau of the General Staff, 3rd Department. And they have another unit called 61486. Karen, I'm sure you are very familiar with those units, and I don't have to explain. But to get back to your question, has the balance of power changed? No, but there's a caveat to that. We shouldn't know, because if we did, then the whole comparative advantage of cyber warfare would be lost. That said, the National Security Agency, and they've got the Tailored Operations Group, and the United States has also got the US Cyber Command. Cyber Command is the operational group which conducts offensive cyber operations, whereas the NSA is more intelligence gathering. The Russia cyber structure that I've mentioned, the FSB and the GRU, engage in hostile cyber operations, as does China. So the point of distinction may be, what are their targets? China seems to be concentrating principally on exfiltration of data, on commercial espionage. That might not be said for Russia. And as to what friendly forces on the West are doing, we don't know, and we'll never know. But I'm willing to bet that they are assisting Ukraine in their cyber warfare efforts. But the major players are China, Russia, and the United States. The Mossad, maybe, I don't know. And I don't know if we'd ever know, but that'd be a great area to research. Has that answered your question at all?
Yes, thanks, Joe. Paul, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That was really interesting. My question concerns a topic that you hit on, superficially, I guess, and didn't really dig down into that. And that is state-sponsored terrorism and transnational criminal organizations who have the ability to target significant aspects of the community across, I'll use the fuel supply system on the eastern seaboard of the United States that was targeted recently, banks, hospitals, in order to extort tens of millions of dollars from organizations. What does the law say about, or what does the international law say about that? And how a nation can respond to those criminal attacks. It's not state versus state, but obviously a state is being attacked. And whether it's from a state-sponsored criminal organization or a criminal organization which is geographically located in a different state. I'm just interested in what the law says about that.
Well, international law says nothing because non-state actors are not subject to international law. So this debate then is going to have to revert to national law or domestic law. And depending on the state in question, there will be extraterritorial reach of jurisdiction. So the United States will exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction on the passive personality rule and reach beyond its own borders to prosecute those parties if they can identify them. The short answer to your question is the law involved is domestic law, not international law, and it's the domestic law of the victim state. But if now, here's an interesting question. I think you were talking about the colonial pipeline extortion. But let's say it was not a pipeline, which is resident within geographic territory, but let's say it was a ransomware attack on the SWIFT system, which is the SWIFT system is the system which governs the international transfer of payments. Each day, there are trillions of dollars of transactions going between countries, between companies, between people. SWIFT system, you may recall, is one of the platforms that Russia was sanctioned out of so that it could not pay its bills. Anyway, let's say that it's the SWIFT system which has been subject to attack. And let's revisit your question, whose law? Well, it's not just the United States, because the victims lie in the United States, but the victims also exist in the countries where the other party of the financial transaction lives. So it'll be Canada, it'll be Great Britain, it'll be everywhere. So every state could exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction and go after that group of cyber mercenaries who is seated somewhere we don't know where. International law has nothing to do with it, but every set of domestic law will allow the victim state to go after the perpetrator. And in an international financial transactions, which permeate the entire globe, you can imagine there will be 194 sets of domestic legislation that will be invoked. Does that help at all or not?
Yeah, that does. And in fact, that just leads to, the follow-on observation that there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to coordinate not only interagency responses to, transnational criminal cyber attacks, but also between nations and allies in whose law will take precedence as they go after that. So, well, yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Thank you for pointing that out, because as soon as you ask whose law prevails, you've just made a liar of me, Paul. Why would you do that? I'm your friend. The reason is that in private international law, as opposed to public international law, private international law is the settlement of conflict of laws. Whose law will prevail? So let's say the United States and Great Britain have both identified their perpetrator of a cyber attack that impacted financial transactions. And the United States, US says, well, look, we're going to apply US law. And Great Britain says, no, we should apply Great British law. And France will say the same thing if they're impacted. That is one of the first disputes to settle. Whose law is going to prevail? And that is a subject of private international law. And I don't know very much about private international law, but it's often settled by arbitration. And then once you've decided whose domestic law is going to apply, then you charge ahead and go after the bad guys. And when you talk about interagency, from what I recall, there's another community of disputes to be settled. Which agency is going to take the lead? Interagency conflict is as prevalent as interstate conflict. Coordination and cooperation have to be the watchwords of the day. Thanks.
So, Joe, I have a question. Can you comment on the seeming good versus evil fight in cyberspace with investigative hackers like Bellingcat in Europe and groups like Anonymous who ensure that perpetrators also become victims? Is there an established moral high ground in cyberspace?
I am not aware of one. And I'll be honest with you, when I come across material like that, I avoid it. And you're going to laugh, Karen, but I'm really not into morality. I'm not. So I can't tell you, but I'll tell you what very, very little I do know, that outfits like Bellingcat are very popular, and they command a high population, or a high readership, or a high followership. But honestly, I can't tell you any more than that, because I don't follow that. I don't follow that argument.
Yeah, I'm interested to, to know these actors, vigilantes with their own declared interests. Is there talk about how they can be regulated by international law? Are we completely at their mercy?
We're not at their mercy. They will not be regulated by international law, but they will be regulated by national law. As we pointed out at the very outset of this presentation, there is a holistic jurisdiction in cyberspace. There is no corner of cyberspace which is not subject to the jurisdiction of a state. And that is the application of the very first principle of international law. Sovereignty prevails entirely throughout cyberspace. And so with that in mind, the domestic legislation of any one or more states can apply to those perpetrators, those hackers, or the people who are what we'll call cyber mercenaries. It's national law, and that's going to be very difficult to execute. You got to find them, you got to get evidence. The rules of evidence apply just as strongly to them as they do to states, as you know, the burden of proof and the standard of proof.
Robert, you have a question?
Well, it just seems to me that the digital domain is incredibly dynamic. Just about anybody can participate. And I take what you were saying, Joe, about international law and also national laws trying to control what is happening in the digital realm. I look at Facebook, I look at Twitter, I look at these other organizations that really are not controlled by national governments at all. And yet they have a huge influence. The other side is the battlefield effect. I was listening to NPR this morning, and they had the most recent American commander of US forces in Europe. And he had become familiar with what was happening in the Ukraine, because previously he had been involved in training some of these forces subsequent to the 2014 invasion by Russia. He was absolutely amazed at how the Ukrainians were taking off-the-shelf technology, notepads, drones, and so on, and integrating them almost seamlessly into the 777 howitzers, for example, and targeting Russian opponents, let's say, or Russian equipment. Also, I think we have to expand what we consider to be cyber warfare, because it's not just the nation states that are involved in it. And to sort of go back to what Paul was saying, you have the Russian government who is working very closely with those criminal elements to perform things in cyberspace. All you have to do is look at the US national election, the mails, the email that was spoofed in the US. So I guess I'm more making a comment than a question, but it just seems to me international law is way behind, and in this dynamic environment, I'm not sure that it will catch up.
International law has as its subjects states, and only states. So international law very clearly says we're not interested in Facebook or Twitter or Anonymous or any non-state actor. So your question becomes, I'm putting words in your mouth, how do you govern, how do you regulate, how do you punish those parties who are operating in international space but are not subject to international law? Sadly, the answer is they have to become the subject of national law. And Facebook, in terms of law, and Twitter and everybody else, they are corporate bodies with legal personality resident somewhere. If it's not resident in the United States, it's in the British Virgin Islands or Cyprus or some tax shelter. But everybody is subject to law somewhere. How effective that law is probably your real point, and the answer is it's not effective. I agree, but it's not effective yet. Sorry, the correct answer to your question, Robert, is it's not effective yet. And I'm a glass half full, as I hope you are, kind of guy. And it's taken 500 years of progressive development of international law to get to where we are today. There's hope, but Robert, you also raised an interesting point at the very beginning of your comment, and that was, how do you govern the effect of the Facebooks of the world? And I guess we have to be more discriminating in what we mean by effect. If it's got influence, that's their job. It's their job to maximize influence. But there has to be a conflict of interest, I suppose, in that influence before there can be a breach of law. And if there's an alleged breach of law, and if there's an alleged breach of law, then there is room for legal action.
It just seems to me, Joe, that the lines are being blurred between what is acceptable conduct by a nation state. For example, again, using Russia as an example, and then using criminal actors to operate within cyberspace under government direction.
Well, on that note, there is hope under the doctrine of command responsibility. But it's a narrow aperture, but it's still there. And if the non-state actors can be found to have committed a breach of international humanitarian law at scale and at gravity, in other words, material lethal effect or material property destruction, then the command element of that non-state actor can be held accountable for a breach of international humanitarian law under the doctrine of command responsibility, or in the case of civilians, superior responsibility. But that is a very narrow aperture, but it exists, Robert. At least it's there. I mean, society recognizes it. It may not be managing it very well, but it is there.
Joe, it's good to hear your optimism. Hi, Alan, you have a question. Okay, I think Alan, yeah, we'll wait for Alan's question to come in the chat box.
You're gonna fire away, Karen?
I was thinking about the issue of vulnerability and bringing up the example of Y2K. It felt like the world was going to end, and it didn't. And it seems as though cyber attacks are fairly common news headlines, yet we seem to also have a resilience. And I'm wondering about the issue of vulnerability. I mean, are we so technically advanced that we can recover from these attacks quite quickly? Or is there real destruction looming out there, like the Y2K scenario?
As a personal opinion, I don't believe there is a risk of material destruction. It is because of the nature of the integrated society that we live in, I don't believe that even the perpetrators can afford to launch a cyber attack that would exploit a vulnerability to such a large extent that there would be that material destruction that you're referring to. However, one of the risks identified at the Davos conference last January was that global society is starting to, I won't say disintegrate, but it's starting to fracture. And there's a greater tendency towards regional convergence. And if that's the case, the argument in favoring multilateralism increases, but the practice of multilateralism may be weakening. And if that's the case, if there are fissures in global society or increasing, widening fissures in global society, then the possibility, let's look at it two ways. The possibility of vulnerability increases, but you also have to ask about the likelihood. There's the impact and the likelihood. Remember that graph we had earlier on with impact up the left-hand side and likelihood along the bottom. It's a two-dimensional argument. How vulnerable? Well, more vulnerable than before, but vulnerability is measured both in terms of impact and the likelihood of the catastrophic event occurring in the first place.
Robert, maybe we'll take one more question here before we wrap up.
Did Alan get through?
I've sent a note to Alan and just waiting to hear back.
Okay.
I'll be Alan's fill-in until he's available. I just get back to the whole blurring of the lines. I know that you were talking about, Joe, material consequences of a cyber attack. But, you know, again, I look at the most recent or the previous US election and how a simple spear phishing email really upended a US election with, from my perspective, disastrous consequences. So my comment is the lines seem to be blurring, and I know you're very positive, but I'm not sure that international law is keeping up with it.
It isn't, but while the lines are being blurred, I guess the values that domestic law is intended to protect and preserve are also changing. So yeah, I see I agree with your point. The lines are being blurred, but I think you're going to also have to agree that the values beneath those lines are also evolving. And you have to ask yourself, why are the lines changing in the first place? They don't change by themselves. It's not like the lines woke up one morning and said, well, I think let's just change for the hell of it. The lines are blurring due to some external source. Well, what is that source? And it may be, you know, the fabric of civil society and the social structures there.
I was just wondering if that's the case, Joe. I mean, there may be a moral aspect to some of these.
Well, then, Robert, I think you are eminently qualified to lead that debate. I am not.
Okay. Well, there is no justice. There is just the law.
I do have Alan's question. As it's 10 after 8 in Calgary, anybody that does need to leave, feel free to cut away. But we'll take another couple of questions here. So from Alan, could you expand on point 3 of your 3 takeaways slide? Are you implying that cyber weapons alone could replace boots on the ground?
That is the proposition. Going back to Robert's point about changes in lines and underlying values, if you could imagine, sounds like something out of a John Lennon song, but if you could imagine that conflicts could be settled with information and legal suasion and moral suasion, then what is the argument for the use of kinetic force? I mean, it's relocating dispute settlement from a battlefield populated with lethal weapons to a forum in which information and influence alone are the weapons. Idealistic, for sure, but that was the proposition. Alan, I don't know if I've clarified it or confused you more.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It just strikes me though, I'm just thinking again in terms, particularly in terms of the current situation in Ukraine, you have a leader like Vladimir Putin that's determined to take over a country, and that's his entire agenda. I don't see him embracing cyber weapons to persuade anybody to do anything.
You're right, and your point highlights a flaw in my proposition. And the flaw is I didn't set out the assumptions. And the assumption is that all parties are logical, if I can phrase that correctly. They subscribe to logic, to cognitive reasoning, and not to some other kind of reasoning. I mean, Russia has had an existential crisis since the 1100s, and it's never going to lose it. So you are right. My proposition is not going to work in the Russia-Ukraine situation. But maybe it wouldn't work in any situation, and it's just a flight of fantasy. But I wanted to get that out just to, I guess, isolate that cyber alone, at least conceptually, has got great potential. It may never be realized.
Right. Yeah, I can certainly see it supplementing, what you refer to as kinetic warfare, but I just find it hard to get my mind around it being the one and only solution. Don't know if you heard that or not.
Yeah, I did, and I'm trying to come up with a response.
By the way, I'm not critiquing you at all. I just searching for a little bit of more illumination.
No, this is great. I'm trying to marshal the argument that the courts of law settle disputes without use of kinetic force. Why is it that states don't always do that? Some disputes are settled in the International Court of Justice or international or arbitration or the law of the sea forums. But why is it that some disputes must be settled with threat or use of lethal force? I don't know, but maybe that is the question that we should replace the question, third point in the first slide, replace that with why is it that states, or why is it that any party resorts to a threat or use of force?
Habits are hard to break.
That's all right. That's an observation, not a reason.
I think
don't
your
know.
point that you're depending on rational thinkers
Yeah.
for your argument to prevail.
And
Certainly worth thinking about, though. Absolutely, there's certainly a case for it.
well, there's a theoretical case. I mean, look, I'm not holding my breath, nor should you.
Yeah.
I don't think you are either.
Yeah.
What would
Thanks, Joe.
Canada's top 5 risks be if you were to plot us on the risk analysis chart?
I don't know, but if I could get access to the World Economic Forum. Robert, are you in front of a computer?
I am indeed.
Can you look up World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2022?
Okay.
So it'll be in a PDF.
Yep.
And it's appendix, I believe it's appendix A at the bottom, maybe page 42, roughly. And there will be every country who attended the Davos conference.
2022?
Yeah, not 2020, 2022, just last January.
Yep. All right.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, what was, so I've got Forum 2022, and the category was?
At the very bottom, global risk report, World Economic Forum Global Risk Report.
While he's doing that, can I make a comment?
Please.
Yeah, although that grid, we had all the various countries, Israel, Iran, the US,
Yeah.
and so on. I noticed only one kind of veiled reference to climate change. I forget the exact term or word that was used, and I thought, wow, that's pretty telling.
Well, remember, my population was really narrow because I wanted to band those by region. And wasn't climate change in China, Alan?
As being kind of the definitive phrase that applies. Just
Well,
a little bit surprised to see that, given it's such a popular topic these days. The Greta Thunbergs of the world and others, Al Gore and so many other people are talking about it, and more of it should be. I'm just kind of surprised it's so low on the totem pole for these countries.
Well, there were other items on that chart, if I recall, called extreme weather events, which, you know, might tie into the same thing. And I
think that was the only one reference to it that I saw.
I know, Alan, I think at the very bottom, the United States had climate change. And I didn't talk about US, but at the very bottom of that chart was the United States. And I believe it had cited climate change in those very terms.
Yeah, I've actually got a picture of the slide. You don't mind that I took a picture of your slide,
Oh,
do you?
listen, yeah, as long as I get a royalty out of it.
I took a picture of the risk analysis slide, and on the top right corner is bright green: climate action failure, extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, human-made environmental disasters. So that's high on the likelihood scale and highest on the impact scale.
Okay, and that was on the 2020 report, right, Karen?
Yeah, risks perceived by all states 2020.
Yeah, and we're now trying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was looking at the 2022 one, and there were just 2 mentions of extreme weather, China and the US. But anyways, I just expected to see more of that in general. I think you get my drift.
Well, again, my population was very slanted. What would be interesting is go through the report, which Robert's trying to track down, and do a search. How often does climate change show up in that PDF document?
If I understand you correctly, Alan, the point that you're making is that very few states identify that as a priority.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
Versus actual risk. Well, Robert, how close are we to?
Well, let me tell you.
Appendix B, I believe, Robert, down at the bottom.
Well, according to this, the 5 categories are, for Canada, debt crisis, climate action failure, and then extreme weather events, and then employment and livelihood crises, and infectious disease. So the debt crisis is the furthest to the left, and the climate action failure is the second.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And no cyber.
No cyber. We're Canadians. Alan, does that inform your argument at all?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I said, I just expected I would see more concern on that front. So, but yeah, thank you very much for addressing that.
So, Robert, does that suggest that Canada has failed to identify cybersecurity as a risk, or is that a risk assessed by the World Economic Forum?
I would say that Canada probably has input into this. However, one of the reasons that we likely are not mentioning cyber risk is that Canada dovetails with the US very, very tightly. And so, for example, I would say the number one cyber actor in the world is actually the United States. And the United Kingdom is probably a close second, but nobody knows about it.
Nor should they.
Go ahead, Joe. What was that?
Nor should they, if
Right.
if the merits of cyber operations are to be respected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we will thank Joe for this fascinating discussion and wish everybody a good evening. And if you're an Oilers fan, go Oilers go. If you're a Flames fan, go Flames go. Please do tune in. Next month, we have Dr. Chris Ankerson from the New York University who will be presenting on warrior culture. That's June 22nd. We hope you'll enjoy. We hope you will join us. And on behalf of RAUSI, I'd like to thank everybody for spending your evening with us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And thank you, Joe, for a wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your busy schedules. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night, all.
Okay, see you.